The spring sun burned down on the wooden awnings of Dry Creek's main street, turning dust into a haze that clung to boots and throats alike. Merchants hawked their wares, children darted between wagon wheels, and cowhands leaned lazy against hitching posts with cigars drooping from their mouths. It was an ordinary market day, until Clara Hayes dragged out her table and set down a saddle frame. At first, no one paid her mind. She moved with brisk, practiced hands, unfurling her roll of needles, thread, and tools. But when she pulled a cracked leather saddle tree onto the stand, the silence began. Heads turned. Men laughed in disbelief. "Lord Almighty," one drawled. "She thinks she can do men's work." Another spat into the dust, grinning wide. "What's next? She gonna shoe horses too? Maybe rope steers?" The chuckles spread, cruel and sharp as spurs. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she kept her gaze steady on the leather. She had mended dresses, gloves, even boots for years. Saddles were no different. Her father had taught her the stitch before. Sickness took him, and if sewing meant survival, then survival did not care for pride. But the crowd did. Two cowboys swaggered closer, their spurs ringing. One slapped the saddle tree with mock approval. "Careful there, missy. If a rider falls and breaks his neck 'cause of your lady stitches, we'll send the bill to you." The other tipped his hat in false courtesy, voice dripping poison. "Best pack up, darling. The trail don't need no seamstress's touch." A ripple of laughter tore through the square. Even the shopkeepers leaned forward, whispering, enjoying the spectacle. Clara's fingers trembled, but she threaded her needle and pulled it through. 1 stitch, 2. She would not give them the pleasure of seeing her quit. "Look at her, too proud to know her place," someone jeered. "Best she marry herself a man who'll keep her from making a fool of herself." The laughter rose louder, echoing off the clapboard buildings. It was a trial by fire, and every eye in town became a torch. Clara's throat tightened. Her father's grave was barely a year settled, her brother gone to war, her mother buried under prairie stone. She had no one left, no roof but the room she rented above the livery, and no skill but the one these men mocked. And still, she stitched. From the far side of the street, a single figure paused. A man in a weather-worn duster, hat brim shadowing his face. He did not join the jeering, nor did he step forward. He simply watched, silent as stone, while the rest of the town circled like buzzards. His presence carried weight, like thunder gathering before a storm, but no one seemed to notice him yet. Clara felt the gaze, though. For a moment, her needle steadied, her spine straightened, and she stitched faster. The jeers rang in her ears, but someone, anchored her. Then, with one quiet step, the stranger crossed the street. The laughter faltered, and the weight of his silence fell, heavy on Dry Creek. The stranger's silence worked like a blade, slicing the laughter clean in two. Boots scuffed, voices dwindled, and by the time he reached Clara's table, the crowd shifted back a step. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his jaw set like stone, cut from the maces themselves. He said nothing, only laid a calloused hand on the saddle tree, studied Clara's stitching, then dropped a silver dollar onto the table. "Bring it to the remuda," he said at last, his voice low as gravel sliding down a canyon. "We'll need 6 more mended by week's end. No threats, no laughter, just instruction." Then he turned and walked away, the crowd parting like grass under the wind. Clara's hand closed around the dollar, her chest rising sharp with air she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The market square, robbed of its entertainment, broke apart. Yet whispers followed her like trailing shadows. "She's going to the ranch. Does he mean the Boone place?" That evening, Clara packed her tools and what little she owned into a canvas sack. The invitation had not been kind, nor soft, but it was a door. And doors rarely opened for women like her. The Boone Ranch stretched farther than Clara had ever seen in her life. Miles of rolling grass met the horizon, dotted with black Angus cattle and fences running long and true. The bunkhouse sat near the stables, and it was there a wiry foreman with a scar down his cheek intercepted her. "You the seamstress?" he asked, disbelief heavy in his tone. Clara nodded, clutching her sack. "Boss says you get a room. Don't make me regret it." He pointed toward the narrow bunkhouse door, then added, "Don't expect the boys'll welcome you. This ain't a place for needlewomen." The words stung, but Clara kept her chin lifted. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and tobacco. Men glanced up from card games and boot polishing. Their expressions ranged from amused to annoyed. One muttered, "Another mouth to feed," while another spat, "Hope she don't spook the horses." Clara slipped into the narrow cot at the far end, unpacked her thread and awl, and folded her blanket tight. She said nothing, just as the stranger had said little. If silence was good enough for the man who owned this place, then silence would be her shield as well. The first days tested her will. Saddles cracked from rain, reins frayed from long drives, stirrup leathers worn thin by months of dust. The work was relentless, her fingers bleeding by nightfall. But she did not falter. Each stitch was an answer to the voices in Dry Creek. Each mend was survival. Still, opposition rose. The foreman often lingered near her table, arms crossed, muttering about wasted leather. Twice dealers in town refused to sell her hides, claiming they were spoken for. She swallowed humiliation and made do with scraps. Yet in the quiet moments, she caught glimpses of the silent rancher. He'd pass through the stables, steady eyes sweeping over the remuda over her work. He never spoke more than a word or two, but his presence lingered like a promise, unspoken, unwavering. And though Clara's bed was hard, her hands raw for the first time in months, she felt a sliver of something she had not dared name, belonging. The spring rains came hard and fast, hammering the plains into a slick mess of mud. The herd grew restless, crowding the fence lines, eyes rolling white. Clara had been working since dawn, mending cinches worn thin by weeks of drives, when the first shout split the air. "Stampede!" The word carried like gunfire. Boots thundered past her as the ranch hands tore toward the corrals. The ground shook beneath Clara's feet, the sound of 100 hooves beating into one frantic rhythm. She dropped her awl and ran. The sky churned gray above the herd, and in that chaos she saw the danger. 2 riders clung to saddles that had begun to slip. The soaked leather straps were tearing loose, flapping with every desperate stride. If the cinches gave way, the men would be thrown under the stampede. Clara's chest clenched. Without thought, she vaulted the corral fence, her skirts dragging mud. "Bring them in," she shouted, her voice carrying sharper than she knew she possessed. The foreman gawked at her, furious. "Get back, woman, you'll be killed!" But Clara was already moving. One rider veered toward the rails, his gelding wild-eyed. Clara caught hold of the reins with both hands, mud splashing up her arms. The saddle was half off, sliding down the gelding's flank. With trembling speed, she yanked the strap free, her fingers flying to her kit still slung at her belt. Needle, thread, leather. Her world narrowed to those 3. She stitched with the same ferocity the herd thundered. Every pull of the thread was a defiance of fear, every knot a plea that this man would not die under hooves. The foreman swore, trying to drag her back, but the rider barked, "Let her work!" His voice rang with desperate faith, seconds stretched long as years. Then Clara slapped the saddle firm and cinched it tight. The rider kicked off, disappearing into the dust storm of hooves. She spun just in time to see the second man's cinch tearing free. She leapt for him, mud sucking at her boots. The horse bucked high, nearly throwing its rider, but Clara dove, knife flashing as she cut away the frayed strap. The animal lurched, but she ducked beneath its belly, threading a fresh length of leather through the ring, pulling hard with every ounce of strength she had. The herd began to settle, cowboys wheeling them back into control. The thunder faded to a shuddering rumble. And Clara, caked in mud, breath ragged, tied the last knot with shaking hands. Silence fell over the corral. The men stared at her as though she had conjured lightning. The foreman's jaw worked, but no words came. The rancher appeared then, tall against the dimming sky. His eyes swept the wreckage, then fixed on Clara. No smile touched his lips, but in his silence was something weightier than applause. "She saved them," one rider said hoarsely, still gripping his reins with white-knuckled hands. "If not for her, I'd be trampled into the earth." The foreman spat into the mud, but even his eyes flickered with reluctant respect. Clara stood straighter, mud dripping from her hands, her pulse echoing in her ears. For the first time since Dry Creek, she did not feel mocked. She felt necessary. That night, as she stitched torn reins by lamplight, one of the younger cowhands lingered near. His voice was awkward, almost shy. "Ma'am, those were the finest stitches I ever saw." And, Clara realized the tide had turned. Summer settled heavy across the plains, pressing the grass flat beneath its heat. Work on the Boone Ranch moved steady, but under the still air, a storm brewed, not of weather, but of men. Clara had begun to feel a fragile rhythm. She rose at dawn, patched cinches, repaired bridles, and kept the tack room neat enough to make even the surly foreman bite his tongue. The cowhands no longer laughed at her presence. Some brought her gear willingly, trusting her stitches as they trusted their own spurs. But not everyone accepted the change. Word spread through Dry Creek that the Boone place had taken in a seamstress. Merchants sneered when Clara walked into town for supplies. A leather dealer shoved her order back across the counter. "You think I'll waste hide on you? Not when real ranches need it." That evening she found her saddle table overturned. Outside the bunkhouse, tools scattered, thread soaked in a trough. The foreman swore it wasn't his men, but Clara saw the truth in his tight jaw. Someone had carried their spite too far. She bent to gather her tools, refusing to weep. But before she could reach the last awl, a shadow fell across her. The rancher, silent as always, stood there. He said nothing, only bent, lifted the table upright, and set it gently in place. Then, without a word, he walked back toward the house, leaving behind a trail of quiet defiance on her behalf. That night, Clara stitched by lantern, her hands raw, but her heart steadier. If she could survive humiliation in town, survive mockery, survive the stampede, then no petty cruelty would break her. 2 weeks later, the real test came. The raiders struck after sundown. Whiskey-drunk men from Dry Creek, half outlaw and half fool, looking for trouble. Shots cracked against the night sky and flames licked at the hayshed. Horses screamed in panic. Clara woke to chaos. She stumbled from the bunkhouse, eyes wide at the sight of riders circling with torches. One of the cowhands shoved a rifle into her hands. "Stay inside," he barked. But Clara didn't stay. She ran toward the stables. The horses, terrified, slammed against their stalls. If they broke free into the fire, they'd be lost. Clara flung open a door, speaking low, steady, coaxing the animals toward the far gate. Smoke stung her throat, firelight burning across her face. Then she heard the gunfire shift, closer, harsher. A man broke from the raiders, his eyes glassy with drink, pistol aimed at the stable. Clara froze, heart hammering. Before the outlaw could fire, the rancher appeared. He moved with the quiet power of a mountain cat, shotgun roaring once, twice. The raider tumbled into the dust. The rest scattered, their bravado gone as quickly as it had come. The flames were beaten back, the shed lost, but the herd safe. Clara leaned against the stall, coughing smoke, her hands shaking. The rancher stepped into the glow of the dying fire, eyes fixed on her. "You held them," he said softly, voice rough but sure. "The horses, you saved them." It was the longest sentence he had ever spoken to her, and in the silence that followed, Clara felt something stronger than fear stir inside her, something dangerously close to trust. The fire left scars across the ranch yard, blackened timbers, and a shed reduced to ash. But in the weeks that followed, something else began to grow. Clara no longer moved through the Boone Ranch as an intruder. She was not merely the seamstress who mended leather. She had become someone the hands nodded to, someone the younger riders sought when their tack failed, someone whose quiet strength was noticed. It began with the children. The Boone Ranch kept a small schoolhouse for the hands' young ones, and Clara often found herself helping patch torn satchels or sewing buttons while their mothers worked the garden plots. One morning, a boy no older than 7 brought her a bridle strap split clean through. He held it out with trembling hands, eyes wide. "Ma says if this breaks again, Pa'll tan me." Clara smiled softly, taking the strap. "Then let's be sure it doesn't." She guided him through, threading a needle, his small fingers clumsy but eager. When the stitch held firm, his face lit with pride. He ran off shouting, "Mama, Miss Clara fixed it!" The title stuck. Soon, little voices called her Miss Clara everywhere she went, and with it came something deeper. One evening, as she finished patching a saddle, the same boy tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Clara, will you be at supper?" "I eat in the bunkhouse," she answered gently. "Pa says you ought to sit at the table," the boy insisted, eyes bright. Clara hesitated, heart caught between fear and longing. Yet when she walked into the big house that night, the rancher himself nodded toward the long table. "Sit." It was not a request. The meal passed in quiet. Bread, stew, the clatter of spoons. But something had shifted. Clara was not a guest. She was part of the table. The foreman still bristled at her presence, muttering about tradition. But his protests grew weak against the tide of acceptance. The cowhands who once jeered now trusted her work more than their own. One even tipped his hat and said, "If you can keep a saddle steady in a stampede, you've earned your place." The children's voices carried it further. One morning, Clara awoke to hear them chasing each other across the yard, shouting, "Hurry, Mama Clara's waiting!" The name froze her in place. A lump rose in her throat. Mama. It had been years since anyone had spoken that word near her, since her mother's passing, since her own dreams of family had been buried under loss. When she looked up, she saw the rancher standing on the porch. His eyes met hers, steady as ever, but softer than she'd ever seen. He gave no smile, spoke no words. Yet in that silence was permission, for the name, for the place, for the fragile hope blossoming between them. By the first frost, Clara was no longer the seamstress fighting for scraps of respect. She was part of the ranch, woven into its life, like thread through leather. And when the children climbed into her lap by the fire, calling her Mama without hesitation, she realized belonging had claimed her before she had dared claim it for herself. Winter yielded to spring, but the rains did not come. By midsummer, Boone Ranch baked under a relentless sun. The creeks dwindled to trickles, and grass crisped to brittle stalks beneath the cattle's hooves. Every sunrise brought the same grim sight, the herd bawling for water, ribs showing sharp against hides. The men muttered of selling stock, of driving them north where rivers still ran. The foreman pressed hard for it, his voice tight with fear. But the rancher shook his head. "We hold." His words were final, though his eyes were shadowed. Clara watched the drought carve hollows into the land and the men alike. The children's laughter grew thin. Meals dwindled to beans and dry bread. Yet she did not falter. Every morning she rose, mending tack with care, patching worn boots, keeping what they had from falling apart. When a wagon train rolled past, its travelers jeering, one woman sneered, "Better pack up, seamstress. Ain't no place for stitches in a dying land." Clara's throat burned, but she only answered, "There's always a place for those who refuse to quit." Her resolve deepened when sickness struck. One of the younger boys collapsed with fever, his mother frantic. Clara sat by his cot night after night, sponging his brow, whispering lullabies her own mother once sang. When the fever broke, the boy clung to her hand and whispered, "Don't leave us, Mama Clara." The name anchored her, She would not leave, not for drought, not for hunger, not for the gnaw of fear. One evening, when the herd staggered lowing to the fence line, the rancher found her in the tack room. She was bent over a frayed lariat, stitching, with trembling fingers raw from weeks of work. He stood in the doorway, silent as always, until she finally looked up. "You can't hold this place alone," she said, voice low but steady. "But together, maybe we can." The lamplight threw shadows across his face, but in his eyes she saw it. Recognition, unspoken admiration, and something more dangerous, more tender. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, and laid his hand over hers. For a long moment, silence stretched, broken only by the hiss of the lantern. Then he spoke, voice roughened by years of solitude. "You've given this place more than I ever asked." His gaze locked with hers. "Stay, not for duty, not for debt, but because you choose to." Her breath caught. In that moment, with cracked leather beneath her hands and the world outside withering in drought, Clara felt the truth settle between them. Belonging had become love, not born of obligation, but of choice. She nodded, tears burning her eyes. Their hands remained joined over the rope, neither pulling away. No kiss sealed the vow, no words of romance. Yet it was more binding than any preacher's blessing. A vow of survival, of love chosen in hardship. That night, Clara lay awake on her narrow cot, listening to the creak of the ranch settling in, the dry wind. She had no gold ring, no lace gown, no wedding hymn. But she had something stronger. A vow carved in silence, stitched into the very heart of the Boone Ranch. The drought finally broke the next spring, when clouds rolled heavy across the horizon and rain fell in sheets that turned dust to life again. The Boone Ranch survived, not by luck alone, but by stubborn hands that refused to let it die. Among them none worked harder than Clara. Seasons turned, years passed, and the ranch grew stronger, steadier, carrying her stitches in every saddle and rein. The cowhands no longer saw her as the seamstress who'd once been mocked in Dry Creek. She was the woman who had saved riders from a stampede, shielded the herd from raiders, nursed children through fever, and stood beside the silent rancher when the land itself tried to break them. Her stitch became more than repair. It became a mark of identity. One spring, the rancher rode into town leading a string of cattle, each branded with a diamond-shaped cross, the same pattern Clara had sewn into the ranch's first remuda saddles. Whispers spread fast. "That's the Boone brand, folks," said of the seamstress's stitch. The name carried weight now, not mockery. It spoke of resilience, of a ranch that endured when others faltered. And it spoke of Clara, the woman who refused to bow. In time, the ranch house grew fuller. Children filled its rooms, laughter echoing through halls that once knew only silence. They called her Mama, not as a borrowed name, but as the truth of who she had become. At night, when the day's work was done, the rancher sat with her on the porch. He was still a man of few words, but he did not need them. His hand resting over hers, the quiet of his presence, spoke everything. As years weathered them both, Clara often returned to her saddle table. Her fingers no longer flew as swiftly, but each stitch she laid was as steady as the first. She mended her children's tack, then her grandchildren's, until the day came when she passed the tools to younger hands. When at last she was laid to rest beneath the cottonwoods by the creek, the rancher stood at her grave, silent as always. He placed her all in the earth beside her, and his voice, low and rough, carried to those gathered. "She gave me everything, this ranch, my children, my life." The words fell like prayer, simple and true. Years later, travelers still told the story. They spoke of the seamstress who came to Dry Creek with nothing, mocked for daring to mend saddles. They spoke of the silent cowboy who saw her not for what others scorned, but for the strength she carried. and they spoke of how her stitch became the Boone brand, lasting long after their names faded. At the ranch gates, beneath the weathered sign, her pattern still burned into wood and hide alike, a testament to grit, belonging, and a love chosen. In silence, yet echoing louder than any vow. And so the story closed, not with tragedy, but with legacy. A reminder that sometimes the smallest stitch holds together the strongest bond. Clara came to Dry Creek with nothing but a needle, mocked for daring to stitch saddles where only men were welcome. Yet through storms, fire, and famine, she found not only her place, but a family, and a love stronger than the land itself, her. Stitch became a brand, her name a legacy, and her story a reminder that redemption can be found in the quietest of hands. If this tale touched your heart, thank you for staying with us until the end. We share true Wild West stories of love, resilience, and the power of choosing family against all odds. Share this story with someone who believes in second chances. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every word, and your voices keep these stories alive. And subscribe if you'd like more tales of grit, redemption, and enduring love.